Let me now introduce Professor Bella Vivante. She's a good friend and a colleague of mine. We've known each other for a good many years. She received her bachelor's degree from Columbia and her PhD from Stanford. And she has taught at Emory. She came to this university in 1990, I believe. 87, okay.
Even older.
Yeah, even older. And she began her teaching here in the Humanities Program, which was really the star core course in the College of Humanities. It was in the College of Arts and Sciences before it was Humanities. It really was our basic undergraduate course in the humanities. After teaching in that for a while, she was invited to move over and join the classics department. That's her training and her education and her interest. So she's been in the classics department now for many years, and she is a full professor in the department. When you look at her vita, it's really pretty packed. I sometimes wonder how a person so young could have accomplished so much. She is constantly giving papers, attending conferences, contributing essays. The brochure has already lists some of one of her books and then some of her articles. She's written a translation of Euripides' play Helen. So she had a varied and very full career. When I look over it, I see that she has 4 areas that have attracted her. And so I'll just spell them out. No, 5. 4, I mean 5. First of all, classics, Greek mainly. Secondly, women's studies. And third, oral cultures. And to mention that one, for her, oral cultures, we're very familiar with the idea of an oral culture in Greece, in the Homeric poems, but she has studied oral culture in the Native American cultures here and in other cultures. One of the most enterprising items in her biography is a 6-month walking tour from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., 6 months. And it was directed and led by Native Americans. So it was an immersion in Native American culture. So that's a very strong interest of hers. She's kept that all the way through her career. She's also been involved with, as I think I already said, women's studies, and also with drama, not only as a scholar, but as a performer, as a director. She's directed performances. She's been in performances here too. Probably 30 years ago, 40 years ago, those areas would not have gone together in one person's research profile. Women's studies was an area of its own. Native American studies was completely different from classics. And so, as I say, they weren't together. She is one of those people who have brought those fields together. All of her career has been interested in interdisciplinary studies and the relevance of something like, let's say, North American oral cultures to our study of classics. So she really has brought a lot together. It's in a very wonderful way. Oh, and one, maybe this is number 5, is her interest in Helen. Now, Helen is an intriguing figure. One person at least in literature went to hell because he wanted so badly to see Helen. And so she's been enigmatic and a rich and provocative symbol for centuries now, and she still continues to interest people. And Bella has given a lot of thought to that image, the power of that image of this person we call Helen, which some people call Helen of Troy, but she is going to give us a different idea. So I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure you will find it very interesting, as I'm sure I will too. So.
Okay, so this is my talk. I love Pat Brooks, in fact, added this Helen of where. Not just the pretty face. Helen of Sparta and Egypt, but not Troy. We all know the story of Helen of Troy, but few of us have followed her to Egypt. That's the first line in the epic poem Helen in Egypt by the modern poet H.D. So as she goes on in her epic poem to explore Helen in Egypt, we need to keep in mind that prior to Egypt, prior to Troy, and this is in spite of what Wolfgang Petersen says in his movie Troy, because he's got it all wrong, of course, Helen belonged to Sparta. So first of all, she is of Sparta. Now, Helen's standing in Sparta was very complex, and there are two separate strands. One is she was a goddess who was worshipped with actual rituals on into the Roman period. So she was seen as divine, worshipped as divine, many rituals. The second strand is the dynastic legends, Helen as the royal queen of Sparta. So I will start off by looking at these two strands in Sparta. And then the third part, that's part of my title, is the mythological tradition that places Helen in Egypt and not in Troy. And so we'll take a look at how that came about as well. So we'll be looking then two aspects of Helen of Sparta, one aspect of Helen in Egypt, and we'll start off by talking about Helen's name. So as we'll see, there are always, every aspect about Helen is very complex. Nothing is simple or singular. So for a long time, scholars believed her name was connected to the word for moon, which in Greek is Selene. But even though in English it might seem like they're very similar, there's just a difference of an H or an S, in fact, in Greek, they're very different letters that are used. So linguistically, this really does not work as an origin of her name. Much more possible is that her name is connected to a word that means reed. And so in origin, Helen was a deity of vegetation. And she was a deity like Persephone, who died annually and was reborn. So she was connected with the whole cycle of vegetation. So when we think in a moment about Helen as representing sexuality, this now is a little bit more of a derived layer if we go back and think of her possibly as an earth deity like Persephone, who died and was reborn like the vegetation every spring. Then we start to get a bit more of a fuller and profound understanding of what Helen then comes to mean in the later stories as the representation of sexuality and eroticism. So I like this possibility. I think it makes a lot of sense. And very interestingly, oh, my title got left out for some reason. I don't know what happened here. But this is the plant comfrey. Any of you who are herbalists may know this is a very powerful healing plant. In modern Greek, it is called Heleneon. The healing plant comfrey is named for Helen. So her connection with vegetation, healing, is brought together in what this plant is called in modern Greek. So, two stories about her name, two different stories of her, oh, here it came up. In modern Greek, oh, for some reason it's doing the, I didn't know this was happening. So, made it a little more interesting in spite of myself. So, Heleneon is the name of the plant comfrey. Okay, moving on then, there are two separate stories about Helen's birth. One, the first story, probably the oldest, is that she was the daughter of the goddess Nemesis. And some of you may be familiar with the term nemesis, punishment or revenge. So what might that mean? Again, given Helen's story, that she would be the daughter of Nemesis. And on a temple of, on a temple of Nemesis at Rhamnus, which is the eastern end of Attica, opposite Athens, there was a whole relief, a portrayal of Nemesis bringing Leda, who we'll see in just a moment, the egg from which Helen will be born. So that, at least in the late 5th century, tries to connect the two stories. But in any case, this is the first story. And the second story, probably the most familiar, is that Zeus came to Helen in the form of a swan. And I meant to get Yeats' poem. I think probably a lot of you are familiar with Yeats' poem of the swan coming to Leda and her, you know, in her fright, the fluttering of the wings as the swan engulfs her, you know, in order to engender the offspring. So here we have an ancient Greek vase painting portrayal of Zeus coming to Leda in the form of a swan. And having been impregnated by him in the form of a swan, she, of course, gives birth, as birds do, by laying an egg. And this is one representation. This is a detail. We'll see the full vase painting in a moment of Helen emerging out of the egg. There are quite a number of vase paintings. This was quite a popular subject. So here we see the egg hasn't been broken yet, but this bird is here ready to start poking the egg to break it open so Helen can emerge. And oops. And then this is the fuller vase painting. Sorry, it's not very clear. But this very likely might be representing an actual comedy, because we see how these characters have the kind of padded costumes that comic actors would wear. So it's possible this might even be, it's possible this might even be representing a scene from a comic play that was produced in Athens. But in any case, we see, again, an example of the popularity of the subject of Helen being born out of her egg. And then just to complete this little part right here, Helen had 3 siblings. So her, wrong button. Her brother Castor also was immortal, so he too was born out of the egg. She had the mortal sister Clytemnestra, who many of you may know was married to Agamemnon. So we have 2 brothers married to 2 sisters. And then the mortal brother Polydeuces, usually known from his Latin name Pollux. So the 2 brothers ended up becoming known as the Dioscuri, meaning the sons of Zeus, and they shared immortality between them. So I'll have something more to say about the Dioscuri in just a moment because of Helen's association with them. But this just sort of completes the birth story and her various siblings, who all will have some important role to play. So with that, I'd like to start then in the specifics by looking at the ritual Helens in Sparta. So Helen figured very significantly in ancient Sparta's ritual life. And she reified in mortal terms the 2 aspects of her divine avatar, Aphrodite, that is beauty and eroticism. So this is what Helen represented, and she represented this in 3 different ways in Spartan ritual. The first way was for adolescents, as they're making their transition into adulthood. The second was as a married woman. Ayla. Thank you. Second way was as a married woman, and thirdly, as a sister to the Dioscuri. So these were the 3 major strands of her ritual roles in Sparta. So starting with her as the goddess who oversees the transition of young women, the term in Greek is parthenos. It's often translated as maiden or virgin, but the evidence from ancient Greece makes it fairly clear that it doesn't have the same meaning as it does today, which really came in with Christianity. There's some controversial evidence, for instance, about ancient Sparta that a parthenos could have a child. Obviously, in that case, parthenos cannot mean virgin in our meaning of the term. So I prefer to use the term unmarried adolescent, which I think more accurately reflects what a parthenos was, which doesn't mean they didn't have some notion of virginity as we do, but it wasn't completely identical with our ideas. So it's an unmarried adolescent who may or may not have already been sexual. That's like the secondary part. So we move, so the transition is of the Parthenos who becomes a bride, and at the stage that she becomes a bride, she also becomes an adult citizen of her community. So what Helen represents are the qualities the young women attain as they are making this transition, the joys of the bride. Now, it appears to some scholars that embracing these two sides, the Parthenos, perhaps virginal, and now the bride, who, of course, will become sexual, that we have some kind of contradiction. But in fact, what Helen is doing is embracing both sides. The Parthenos, who has the potential sexuality that the bride will be fulfilling, and Helen functions as the connective link between these two. So, beauty symbolized a girl's maturity and readiness for marriage, which could be actual physical beauty, but not necessarily only physical beauty. It signified that the girls were now the object of male desire and that they were capable of arousing male desire. Beauty also represented that the girls had now received the grace of Helen's beauty, which endows them with the possibility now of making this transition into being brides. So Helen represents a very distinct stage in a woman's transition as she goes from girlhood to adolescent into adulthood. It is the specific stage of the bride. So this is different from goddesses like Athena or Artemis, who oversaw rituals that took a girl up to puberty, and very different from rituals of goddesses of marriage, like Demeter or Hera. So this is like a thin sliver in between the prepubertal and pubertal rites of certain goddesses and the rites of now fully mature married women. So that of the bride and this transition makes like this in-between space between the very young and the mature woman. So let's see. So Helen as bride, there are many images of her as bride, some showing Menelaus actually taking her away, but also quite a few that show her with Paris. And in fact, in Athenian wedding pottery, Dr. Saki will tell me in a moment if I'm making a great, egregious error, but Helen represents the bride in Athenian wedding pottery. Now, given that Athens, we know, was the most repressive, oppressive, suppressive, depressive of women of any ancient Greek community, and women absolutely had to be sexually faithful to their husbands, why would Helen in Paris represent, or why would even Helen by herself represent the bride? Obviously, they're not planning to follow her into adultery, or maybe they are, but they can't be open about it, certainly. So clearly, there's something else Helen is representing for the ancient Athenians, even more so for the ancient Spartans, which is the qualities that she represents independent of all these social frameworks. Forget marriage, forget adultery, forget all these societal stuff, but what are, we might say, like the fundamental qualities that she represents. So I think in that sense we can understand how even in Athens, Helen still becomes the epitome of the bride in wedding pottery, aside from the stories, certainly of adultery and so on. So in this way, then, Helen parallels the role of Aphrodite more largely throughout the Greek world, but Helen represents this specifically in Athens, and again, crystallizing now this woman's transition from Parthenos to Gune. Now, the ancient portrayals of Helen in this aspect, overseeing young women's rituals, is as a leader of the chorus. And when we use the term chorus in ancient Greece, it means both singing and dancing. So we very nicely have one representation of, from an ancient Greek vase painting of women dancing, but this is still such a vital feature of modern Greek life, dancing, whether in sex-segregated or mixed circles. So I'd like to read you a couple of quotes from ancient Greece about Helen as chorus leader. The first is from the ending of Aristophanes' Lysistrata, a play that many of you probably are familiar with, and almost the very last lines of the play by the Spartan ambassador is to praise Helen, excuse me, as the pure, outstanding daughter of Leda, the chorus leader who leads off the dance. So one there in Aristophanes' Lysistrata, Euripides' Helen, that Norman mentioned, also envisions Helen as the chorus leader there by the banks of the Eurotas. And even earlier, both of these are the end of the 5th century, but if we're in about the middle of the 7th century, the Spartan poet Alcmon, in a poem of his often called Parthenaeon, usually translated as maiden song, but there's some evidence that it actually may be a wedding song. Excuse me. So in Alcmon's Parthenaeon, he portrays the adolescent who's completing her transition to the status of bride as preeminent among the other Parthenoi. So I sing of the light of Aigido, I see her like the sun, whose shining light she calls forth as our witness. She shines preeminent, just like a strong, victory-winning, hoof-resounding horse stands out among grazing herds. And there's our running horses. A couple of, now moving forward to the Hellenistic period, early 3rd century, the poet Theocritus, in one of his poems called Idyll 18, known as the wedding song of Helen, the epithalamion of Helen. So he also continues to describe Helen in superlatives. Rosy-skinned Helen outshines all. She's like dawn emerging from night, like tall cypresses bordering a field, like a Thessalian horse. She's the most outstanding weaver and singer of tales. Her eyes exude desire. Theocritus's poem also makes clearer that the chorus leader, in emulation of Helen, is modeling her new status for the other girls. Oh, beautiful one, oh, grace-imbued girl, you are already mistress of your house. But in the morning we shall garland ourselves, breathing the sweet fragrance of the meadows, and remembering you, Helen, like sucking lambs long for their mother's teat, around your shade-giving plane tree we'll lay wreaths of lotus and pour sleek oil, and we'll write on its bark for any passerby to recite in Doric, revere me, I am Helen's tree. And so the plane tree associated with Helen, located in an area called, not that, but located in an area called the Dromos at Platanistas, just south of Sparta. And so this is an engraving. I'm sorry I did not get who this is by. Some of you may be familiar with it. But this gives us an idea. The Dromos is the pathway. So this is where young men went through their rituals of attaining adulthood in honor of the Dioscuri, and this is the same place where young women celebrated their rituals for attaining adulthood for Helen. So we have a parallelism between the rites of both the young women and the young men. Both are attaining civic adulthood, and both do it by performing rituals in the same location. And this is just one example, just as a little side note, of the equivalency between men and women in ancient Sparta. So both in the education of young girls and boys, this equivalency, in the rituals that bring both of them to adulthood independent of marriage. So with all my emphasis on Helen, the transition from adolescence to the bride, what's really important is that at these rituals, girls become adult members of the community of Sparta, independent of their marital status. Now, certainly in Athens, that's completely unheard of. Whether that occurs in other ancient Greek communities, we simply don't have enough evidence to say. But I believe we have enough evidence for me to say that uncategorically about Sparta. So women could attain status as an adult independent of their marital status, which is, very unique, at least as far as we know about Sparta. So let's see. So yes, the close connection then between Helen and her brothers. So this pretty much is the overview of Helen's roles overseeing these young women's transitions. We've actually spent more time on this than on some of the others, simply because of all that's involved. So the second way Helen was worshipped was as a married woman. And she was worshipped at Therapne, which is across down below there is the Eurotas River, and Sparta is just on the other side. Now, I and a few other scholars recently have come to call this a Heleneion, and I'll explain this in just a moment. So what we do know from the historical evidence, the archaeological evidence at Therapne, is first that it was a prototype for Mycenaean palace architecture. So from the early 16th century, subsequent Mycenaean palace architecture somehow derived from what was done here at the Heleneion. Later, in the Archaic period, meaning 8th to 6th centuries, when the hero cults were first getting developed in ancient Greece, at the Heleneion is the oldest evidence of an ancient Greek hero cult. As is characteristic of most ancient Greek hero cults, they are usually to some male and female pair. They are not really to only one or the other. So this one was to Helen and Menelaus. All the early evidence shows that the offerings were to Helen alone, the earliest evidence. Also, all the early evidence, not only early evidence, all the evidence says Helen was worshipped as divine at this site. So this is not unusual in Sparta to have two figures worshipped, one of whom is divine and the other of whom is mortal. So whatever was going on in the notion of Helen as Menelaus's wife, we have no idea what that meant for the Spartans. We cannot assume about any other culture what a marriage relationship means and what the husband-wife relationship is actually like within the marriage relationship of any other culture, because all of these things are culturally specific. What we do know is Helen is worshipped as divine. She has her own independent source of offerings that are made to her alone. And it is not until the 2nd century after Christ, the geographer Pausanias, when he goes around identifying everything in Greece, and he's just, a treasure trove, we would know like a nano of what we know if it weren't for Pausanias. He's the first one to call this a Menelaon, a sanctuary. And he uses the term naos, which is only used for sanctuaries of deities. He calls it a sanctuary of Menelaus, which I think he got it wrong, obviously. Because like I say, all the early evidence, archaeological, documentary, literary, poetic, everything shows that this was focused on Helen. So I and a few other scholars now call this the Heleneion, And if we're lucky, this will actually catch on one day, and this wonderful site will no longer be misrepresented by the wrong name. Okay, that's my little rant on nomenclature right there. But in any case, what is clear is that Helen is endowing married women with, again, her qualities of beauty, eroticism, and sexuality. These are qualities that married women will use in marriage. It's not that they're going to follow Helen, just like the Athenian women, down a path of adultery, but they, again, take on what she represents in order to fulfill their roles as wives within the marital situation. So this notion of Helen as divine, Menelaus as mortal. Menelaus gets all kinds of perks for his marriage to Helen, including which he gets to go to the Elysian plain, that is the land of the blessed in the afterlife. So he hasn't really accomplished anything on his own to merit this, other than, you know, he got the luck of the draw and got to marry Helen, and so he gets all these bennies as a result. Okay, so that's pretty much that. So we've seen Helen, the transition from adolescent to adult, now Helen for married women. So also at Theropne, Helen is worshipped together with her brothers, the Dioscuri. And even though this is quite a late image, we in fact don't have early visual images of Helen together with the Dioscuri. Most of these are Hellenistic or Roman, but we do see here Helen in between her two brothers. Excuse me. So given the important role of the Dioscuri as major deities overseeing the welfare of the city of Sparta, and in fact in the 5th century the Athenians tried to appropriate the Dioscuri to be the important deities there in Athens. So to the extent that Helen now is being worshipped together with her brothers, I'm sorry, shows that she too somehow is the protective deity overseeing the well-being of Sparta. And so in this way, and this is characteristic again of many deities, we see this whole range of roles that she represents, from the ritual, from, you know, going through various transitions, personal experiences, to the civic role overseeing the whole community of Sparta. So these then are Helen's ritual roles, the 3 different strands. The next piece I would like to look at is Helen as Queen of Sparta. So this is a completely separate legendary tradition, and we know of this primarily again from Pausanias in Book 3 of his description of Greece, gives a legendary history of Sparta's dynastic lineage. And in this dynastic history, in about the 6th generation from the start, sometimes it gets a little confusing trying to count these down, but Helen appears, and what she does is she emulates the role of someone earlier in the dynastic lineage by the name of Spartae. So a female who obviously gave her name, oh, we're back to that again, a female who gave her name to the city of Sparta. Now, what's significant about Spartae, and what Helen then repeats, is that they make kings out of the men that they marry. So they are kingmakers. Now, this is even more unusual for Helen, because when she confers kingship on Menelaus, because of his marriage to her, her brothers are still alive. As early as Hesiod, the earliest Greek author we probably have, we have reference to the fact that it's her brothers, the Dioscuri, who greet the suitors as they come to woo Helen, and who may even be making the marital arrangements. Now, you probably all know that ancient Greece was a highly patriarchal culture. And in the patrilineal line, a son would naturally become king upon the death of his father. Why is Helen a kingmaker if both her brothers are still alive? Something really interesting is going on in this tale. To me, that tells me Helen had such an important role in the transference of rulership that was so important that it outweighed what would be seen as the primary right of her brothers to ascend to the rulership. So somewhere in this tale, I think we're getting glimpses of whatever realpolitik is going on in the 16th century between the rulers of Sparta, the rulers of Mycenae, the rulers of Argos, and Tyndareus, Helen's mortal father, needs to secure his rule of Sparta. And so instead of letting one of his own sons, who are, after all, the sons of Zeus, but that's a separate tale. Anyway, instead of letting his own sons ascend to the rulership, he has his daughter crown the king of who she marries. So very interesting stuff, just, you know, in that one little bit of the tale. So somewhere then along the way, and we don't have any record to indicate when, how, or anything, the divine Helen, who was worshipped as a goddess, and the royal Helen in the dynastic legend blended together. And so through a lot of the mythology, even the literature, we see a kind of composition or a blending together of these two figures. Somehow ended up coming together. We can understand her divine heritage in that she gets off scot-free from the Trojan War. Those of you who have read the Odyssey know she goes back to rule gloriously back home in Sparta. Homer always identifies her as the daughter of Zeus, and all the epithets he uses to describe her are otherwise only used of goddesses. So we are constantly reminded in the literature, certainly in Homer, of her divine heritage. So the next step is what results from this tension between the ritual Helen and the mortal Helen. And this brings us to the Helen in Egypt tale. So, as H.D. remarked, as we saw, most people know the story of Helen of Troy, most beautiful woman in the world. She was the prize for Paris choosing Aphrodite as the most beautiful of the goddesses, and her abduction by Paris sparked this 10-year war that devastated Greek and Trojan forces and destroyed Troy. But our earliest written evidence, but I believe this also comes out of the oral tradition, the late 7th century Sicilian poet Stesichorus gives us another tale. That story is not true. You never mounted the well-fitted ships. You never arrived at the towers of Troy. And Stesichorus then goes on to tell a tale of Helen being whisked by Hermes off to Egypt. Meanwhile, Hera formed a phantom image of Helen that was sent to Troy. So, what did Greeks and Trojans fight over? Some illusion. So we have reference, as I say, the story by Stesichorus. We have some references to it by Hesiod and Homer. The historian Herodotus goes on to say that both Homer and Hesiod knew this tale of Helen in Egypt, but they suppressed it for their own poetic purposes. So the tale goes way back, and we have our most extensive version in Euripides' play, Helen. And Euripides definitely emphasizes the point that Greeks and Trojans fought over an illusion, and any pretext for war is an illusion. So to use a modern analogy, for Agamemnon and the Greeks, Helen was their WMD. That gave them a pretext for going and invading Troy and besieging Troy for 10 years. So, so why does Stesichorus give us this other version? Well, as a Western Greek from Sicily, which was Doric, like Sparta, Stesichorus may be trying to defend the integrity of the Spartan goddess against the depredations of the Trojan War tales that want to make her out to be blameworthy for the war at Troy. We see this emphasis, a positive emphasis on Helen, on her positive qualities in Homer, in Sappho, in at least some of Euripides' plays, in Herodotus. So not all the ancient tradition about Helen is only of her as the cause of war. We really have two strands almost equally strong throughout the ancient Greek tradition. The one Helen that is cause of war we know mostly from Athenian drama. Certainly some of the earlier poets, but the most vicious portrayals are by Aeschylus and in some other plays of Euripides. So the Athenian dramatists really went after her in a big way. But in Stesichorus' story, and those who follow that story, Helen is completely blameless. She is innocent. She's completely removed from anything having to do with Troy, with the carnage at Troy. And now we see that she deserves to return innocent to Sparta, to return to the choruses, and so on. So in a couple of minutes remaining, I just want to raise a couple of questions, and you probably have other questions, which is fine. But one is, why is the Helen of Troy story the one that has mostly been transmitted in the Western cultural tradition? So there have been a few exceptions. Goethe, H.D., Judy Grahn, one of the other poets whose books I had. I hope it's there at the bookstore. But the Helen of Troy is certainly the one that's most known in the popular tradition. Not only Wolfgang Petersen's movie, but I just found this, you know, exploring on Google. So here's a hip-hop Helen of Troy, tells all. So it's like all you have to do is mention Helen of Troy, and everyone is familiar with that. But why don't we know these alternate tales, which, as I say, were equally as strong in ancient Greece? Another question is, what is involved in making a mortal character out of a divine one? So Homer in the ancient world, H.D. in the modern world, both explore what it means for the character Helen to be a mortal icon of divine qualities. What does that do to a mortal to have to represent divine qualities? So this is a tension, which is why Homer's poems are so brilliant, because he really explores this complexity. And then in the modern world, H.D.'s poem, now from a modern woman's perspective, still exploring this kind of tension. So I think I'll stop with that. You may have some questions or comments that I'm happy to entertain.